Prateek Yadav news live, extremely saddening, says Akhilesh Yadav on stepbrother's death, Mint. The leverage shift starts now. Here is the signal that separates noise from actionable change. We will map trigger, incentive shift, and downstream impact before the close. Akhilesh Yadav, one of India's most prominent opposition voices, has just spoken publicly about the death of his stepbrother, Prateek Yadav. The statement is brief but loaded with emotion, extremely saddening, and that language choice, in the context of Indian political messaging, signals something worth paying attention to. Here's what we know so far. Prateek Yadav's death has not been widely detailed in mainstream coverage, but the fact that Akhilesh is breaking his public silence on it matters for one clear reason: family crises are often the inflection points where political narratives shift. When a leader steps out of their operational role to acknowledge personal loss, the timing, the tone, and the audience they choose to address become data points. Akhilesh didn't issue a formal press release. He spoke directly, which suggests this is genuine, not performative. Why does this matter beyond the immediate family? Because Akhilesh Yadav is the face of Samajwadi party leadership, one of the largest regional parties in India's most populous state, Uttar Pradesh. His bandwidth, his ability to campaign, negotiate with coalition partners, and mobilize his base, directly affects the political math of the opposition bloc. Any shift in his focus or energy has ripple effects across state politics and, indirectly, across the national opposition strategy heading into the 2024 to 2025 political cycle. The second implication is about perception. In Indian political culture, how a leader handles personal grief in public is a character signal. Akhilesh's statement, calling it extremely saddening rather than, say, playing it down or staying silent, is a moment of visibility. It humanizes him, yes, but it also shows his supporters and his opponents that his inner world is affected. This can strengthen loyalty among his base, who see a relatable human, but it can also be read as a moment of vulnerability by rivals. The opposition will be watching whether this translates into any operational pause in his political movements. What changes next? Over the next 48 to 72 hours, watch three things. First, whether Akhilesh steps back from any scheduled campaign events or political engagements. A pause is normal; a complete withdrawal would signal the family situation is more severe than the public statement suggests. Second, watch the social media and news response. If his statement triggers an outpouring of sympathy from the opposition ecosystem, that's a consolidation moment. If it's crickets, that tells us something about how his coalition partners are reading his current political strength. Third, keep an eye on whether any opposition leaders issue joint condolence statements or whether this remains isolated. In Indian politics, how the ecosystem responds to a leader's personal crisis is often a proxy for how much political capital that leader still has. Here's the contrarian angle nobody's discussing yet. Prateek Yadav's death could actually give Akhilesh a strategic pause he might have needed. The 2024 to 2025 period has been brutal for the opposition: infighting, electoral losses, alliance fatigue. A family tragedy creates a legitimate reason to step back, regroup, and recalibrate without looking weak. It's not a gift, but it's a reset button he can press without losing face. His rivals might see it as weakness, his advisors might see it as a window to reorganize. The final piece is about institutional memory in Indian politics. Akhilesh's father, Mulayam Singh Yadav, shaped modern Uttar Pradesh politics for decades. Family transitions in regional power structures are always moments of uncertainty. If Prateek Yadav held any informal role in the party or family operations, his death might trigger a minor succession conversation. Akhilesh is the obvious heir and leader, but in Indian politics, nothing is automatic. Bottom line, this is a personal tragedy that has immediate political dimensions. It's not a scandal, not a scandal-adjacent situation, it's a human moment in a political life. But in Indian politics, human moments are always also political moments. How Akhilesh navigates the next week, how present he is, how he frames his role, how his coalition responds, will tell us whether this is a speed bump or a genuine reset. Keep watching the Samajwadi Party's official communications, Akhilesh's social media, and opposition alliance meetings. Those will be the real signals. Follow at Atlas Signal Desk on X for real-time political intelligence on India and beyond. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next.